Okay, it is 7 o'clock and we are about to get started. Thank you so much for joining me for our E-DECOLONIZE course number 3. So to begin, I am going to share my presentation for tonight. Really important. I'm going to be sending you a Google form for you to fill out as soon as you can, as soon as this class is over. So let's start off with the class tonight. Okay, so we are starting 7 o'clock. Tonight is Friday 15. We have an action-packed class tonight. So much to talk about. And the topic tonight we're going to be going over is the decolonial history of Mexico. Really important. So I'm just tuning in. Okay, shout out to everyone joining me tonight. Let us know where you're joining us from, your name, city, and state. That would be great. I'm really excited. All right, we have Elizabeth, Payson Control Center, Jen Rivera, Sin420. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining me tonight. All right, without further ado, let's get started. Okay, so for tonight, class number 3, E-DECOLONIZE, we are going to unpack and decolonize the way Mexican history has been presented to us. I'm talking about Mexican history because that is what I grew up with, right? That is what I am categorized by. I personally identify as an Indigenous woman, but that is something that we're gonna completely unpack tonight. So tonight it says, decolonial history of Mexico in indigenous resistance and white supremacy from 1519 to now. Origins of terms Raza and Mestizaje. Okay, so just wanted to check in. Can everyone hear me okay? All right, here we go. Let's do this. Welcome, everyone. This is for all ages, all educational backgrounds. As we have talked about before, the class norms is, this is a safe space. I want people to be able to feel safe here. We have families joining us. We have kids with their parents. We have families gathering around to learn this information. As you all know, I have a zero tolerance policy in my class on this online course. We do not accept any hate comments, anything that is considered toxic. I have a lovely community of students who are helping me censoring that. I don't believe that I work so hard, right, to get this together, and I'm not gonna allow any space for that. Donations, contributions, I wanna thank those of you who did fill out the Google form. I'm really excited, and I was very happy to hear your perspectives and your questions and comments. A lot of you asked me about my contribution handles. If you choose or would like to contribute to what I'm doing, I have a Zelle account, Cash App, and Venmo. So you can always contribute there. I'm really grateful. Again, this is free. I do this for free. I do this because I believe that information and that this knowledge should exist for all of our communities and not just in academia. And as always, I would like to invite you to fill out the Google form that I have attached to the video description of this video. So at the end, when I upload this video, I do make that available. And I'm gonna try to answer some of the questions tonight. There's just so much to go through, and I wanna be respectful of our time. I am so prepared. I've done so much research on this. My perspective is shifting with all the new research that's coming out, with all the new decolonial voices. And also for those of you, you can find me outside of YouTube. I am only available on Facebook at the moment. So you can follow my work under Facebook page, Mexican Excellence. So here we go. All right, let's get started. Decolonial history of Mexico. As you can see, I've taken the liberty to redesign the Mexican flag the way that I see it. And the way that what you're looking at there is a Mexica image of Mexico Tenochtitlan. You see the borrowed image of the Criollo flag. And then you see an image of the casta system, which we're definitely going to unpack tonight. So sit back, relax, and let's decolonize. Let's do this. Okay, to begin, some of the books that I recommend in the Spanish language are three of these books. There's a lot, right? But I wanted to boil down to these three powerful books. The first one is México Profundo by Guillermo Bonfil Batalla. He was a Mexican anthropologist who basically resisted the Eurocentric form of interpretations of anthropology. And in this book, and we're going to unpack it later, but he basically talks about that the Mexican culture, Mexican civilization as we know today is actually founded and actually exist above what he calls the Mesoamerican foundation. So he talks about the imaginary Mexico that wants to be the pro-Western, pro-Eurocentric, pro-colonial. And he talks about the real Mexico, the Mexico Profundo, which is the one that continues to be colonized and continues to be repressed by the Criollo governments. So here we go. The second book, it's actually a cartoonist. His name was Eduardo del Rio Garcia. This book you can find, I'm sure you can find it anywhere. I'm not sure if it's Amazon or whatnot, but this is a cartoonist that we're actually gonna get into tonight. It says 500 años fregados pero cristianos. 500 years Christians but screwed up, right? And I'm trying to be mindful of the language because I know we have minors joining us. And lastly, I am very excited to share this book with you. It's called México Racista, una denuncia de Federico Navarrete. This book I've been obsessed with this book, with this research. This Mexican anthropologist is completely joining in other historians that are completely confronting white supremacy in Mexico, from the desaparición de las mujeres de Juárez, from the Ayotzinapa. It's just amazing. So let's get into that. First and foremost, I know there's so much to say in the history of Mexico, but I will focus on what I consider the most detrimental lies and the most detrimental interpretations that we are given of, the so-called, Spanish conquest of Mexico, right? That's the stereotypical view that we get. That's what you're taught in Mexico. That's what we're taught in Chicano studies. That's what we're taught in many courses that talk about Mexican history. So tonight, let's unpack what that was about. So as you see here, I have the invasion of Mexico by Spaniards, right? So stereotypically, or what we know is in 1519, right, our lands that are known today as Mexico are invaded by a group of Spaniards led by Hernán Cortes. Hernán Cortes was in open defiance against his captain that did not allow him to travel and leave where he was at in the islands. So he openly defied and came anyway, right? So the view that we get is usually that, that the Mexica enemies openly embraced the Spaniards and they allied with them automatically. But that's not really what took place here. What took place was resistance since day one that the Spanish invaded the landmass that we know today as Mexico. They were confronted with violence. They were confronted with resistance. The most popular group that we know today, which is a Tlaxcalteca. The Tlaxcalteca actually fought the Spanish, that is documented, for 2 weeks of heavy, bloody confrontations with the Spanish. They did not openly ally themselves with them right away, right? So that's something that we have to be very mindful of, because everywhere you go, it's like, oh yeah, because the Mexica weren't united, everyone hated them, everyone joined them, and there you go. But it was more complicated than that. And, I myself am challenging my perspective of Mexica because, growing up, that's what I was studying. I have a bias on Mexica civilization. But the more I'm learning, the more I'm decolonizing, the more I am complicating and being more diverse in how I am interpreting our history. The Tlaxcalteca were a powerful group of people, and let's get into what happened there. So basically, we have to challenge ourselves the way, the power and the intentions are always placed on the Spanish, right? It's always about, oh, when Cortes met Mexica, or when Cortes led the Spaniards, or when Cortes used the Tlaxcaltecas for his advantage and he manipulated the allies of the Mexica. Well, a lot of historians are actually challenging that very Eurocentric perspective of what happened here, right? So let me ask you this. If we have an image, right, of 550 Spaniards, right, that came and invaded our lands, you know, who helped who? When we have an actual investigation, there's been actual studies that show that the alliance of indigenous people that allied themselves with the Spanish could have been as minimum as 20, 40, 80,000 to 100,000 indigenous people that allied themselves with the Spanish. Now, we have to be very critical of this perspective because we are taught to see the indigenous allies as subjects, as having no agency, that they just joined the Spanish and that they were used, right? And they had no agency. Well, in this point, I want us to challenge that interpretation and say, no, this was an indigenous world, right? You're going into an indigenous world. The indigenous allies, the Tlaxcalteca and other groups, they're trying to use the Spaniards, not the other way around, right? And we're always told that the Spanish had the control, had the power. But in this interaction, who really used who, right? Who really was the one that created that power, right? And this is only speaking on the warfare aspect of it. We're not even getting into the other things that happen. And so we have to be very mindful of what was happening here, right? We're looking at Cortes invading in 1519, and they called the destruction of Tenochtitlan that actually took place August 13, 1521. And a lot of things happened during that time. We have the intentional spread of smallpox, right? That was really, really damaging and harming the Mexica civilization and the Mexica allies. Because again, it wasn't just the Mexica and a bunch of allies. It was so complicated. There's so many group of people that are trying to survive and that are trying to, you know, continue their way of life. And one of the myths that I really want us to debunk together tonight is the myth that Moctezuma II actually viewed Cortes as Quetzalcoatl. And this is huge. And I want to unpack this. I want to debunk this because let me tell you, I went to Xcaret a few years ago. And in Xcaret, in Yucatan, right, they have at the end of the night, they have a play, right? It's a world-class play about the history of Mexico. And at the end, right, when they show that the Spaniards arrive or invade, they're told, oh, ya vino Quetzalcoatl. Quetzalcoatl has come. And this is happening in Mexico, in Xcaret, which they try to follow, you know, authentic dress interpretations of Mexican history. And so in my head, I'm like, man, if this is happening in Xcaret at a world, you know, first class play, you know, that they're presenting, then we still have a lot of work to do to debunk this. So let's look at the actual myth that Cortes was received as Quetzalcoatl. Well, the source that I'm using tonight, you can find this as a PDF. It's called Burying the White Gods, New Perspectives on the Conquest of Mexico by Kamala Townsend. Now, this has been the most thorough article that I have come across that actually gets into why this is such a lie, right? And so there are 5 huge points to why this is a lie. And I want us to be very careful with this because, again, the European lens always tries to patronize indigenous people, make it seem like we were just eternal children who were obsessed, right, with all these quote unquote gods. And they make it seem that that was our demise, that we brought this upon ourselves and that we were expecting to be killed in the millions, that we expected the genocide as a way to justify what happened to our ancestors and as a way to kind of excuse it, right? And say, oh, well, you know, they were expecting him. So, you know, it made sense. It does not make sense, right? So let's get into it. So first and foremost, if you read all the letters that Cortes wrote, right? All the letters that he wrote, boring, stupid letters where he's completely putting himself out there as this, you know, great explorer and conqueror, because they were trying to, he was supposed to be jailed for openly defying his capitan that he was under. So remember, he has to portray himself as something huge and and gigantic, like plays such a heavy role because he needs to impress the Spanish crown. He needs to impress the people that he's under, right? So let's keep that in mind. So in the letters that he wrote, he not once mentioned that he was considered to be a god or that he was taken to be a god. Not once does he mention this. Number two, Moctezuma II, right, who was the Tlatoani, who was the leader of the Mexica at that time. In the original sources, and there's only a handful of written documents by the Spanish and the clergy that actually talk about this, it's really important because in those accounts, you know, Moctezuma does not say, oh, Cortes, Quetzalcoatl, you are here. It's not that. This is a quote given supposedly what Moctezuma said, right? And he says, woe to us. In what way have we offended the gods? What has happened? Who are these men who have arrived? Where did they come from? Now, does that sound like a leader who is expecting a god, who is considering Cortes a god? No, he according to this interpretation in the original sources, he was saying, who the heck are you? Why are you here? What have we done to deserve your pestilence on our lands, right? So that is Moctezuma. Third, in the Florentine Codex, which is a 12-volume set of books that were written as a way to investigate indigenous philosophies, histories, as a way to Christianize, right, indigenous people. Sahagún, who's a fraile at the time that was in charge of this account, he doesn't mention this, or he doesn't talk about this happening until the 1560s. That's when the Codex was actually put together, was actually organized. And so that's decades later after this took place. So if this was such a powerful incident that took place, wouldn't it have been mentioned in Cortes's letters? Wouldn't it have been used to further the invasion and robbery of indigenous resources? Okay, and number four, this is really, really important. Number four, Moctezuma II, he knows that the Spanish have invaded. He sends spies every day to monitor the whereabouts of the Spaniards. He doesn't just say, oh, they're here. Oh, okay. You know, Quetzalcoatl is here. No, if he thought that Cortes was Quetzalcoatl, he would not have sent spies, right, to spy on these enemies, right? And you have to understand, in Mexica warfare society, in many indigenous societies of so-called Mesoamerica, war was a big deal. War had a whole culture of how you approached enemies, how you established peace, how you established war. It was a lot of things, right? You don't just show up and declare yourself. So anyway, so Moctezuma sends spies daily over to see what the heck was going on with Cortes. And lastly, point number 5, the writing of the Florentine Codex. Again, that is a 12-volume books that were written by a lot of indigenous Mexica people that were indoctrinated already, right? And they're being asked to write about their culture. They're being asked to what do you remember about the Mexica culture, about your education, about where kids are born. It's a massive thing. We can dedicate a whole class to that. But it's important to understand that Kamala Townsend is pointing out that there's a lot of similarities between the omens found in the Codex compared to those found in the Greek and Latin texts. So what does that tell you? Right? That tells you that there was a lot of manipulation here. There's a lot of interpretations. And again, this is in the Inquisition of indigenous people, and they're writing these documents. So we have to be very critical with what they're using to talk about how the so-called Spanish conquest, which I disagree with that term. I think it's very triumphalist, and it's not proper. So all right, and let's not forget that at the same time of the Spanish invasion, we have genocide taking place. Like we talked about last week, this was an open genocide, intentional. We have violence, we have intentional use of biological warfare. We have the death, right? The intentional death of about 23 million people in the Valley of Mexico. This is an atrocious genocide, horrific experience for our ancestors at that time. And let us look at visual kind of graph to show you where we're looking at here, right? So biological warfare, we talked about this last week, but it's really, really important for me to repeat this because, again, it's not something that's accepted by academia. It's not something that is considered a genocide. So if you're looking at the graph here, you're looking at the so-called collapse, which I do not like these words, the population collapse. It's actually the population execution, the genocide of the people here. And you'll see how many deaths took place because of biological warfare. And like I talked about last week, remember we talked about biological warfare. We talked about how Europeans were doing this already in Europe. They did have these understandings, right, of how biological warfare worked. So how did they come over to our lands and all of a sudden forget about these tactics, forget that they were using biological warfare in Europe? And if you study this in very much more detail, there's a lot more cases that they tried doing this to all the people they came across, from the Canary Islands to African peoples. I mean, they were trying everything they could to kill the populations that they were coming across. Because let's remember the papal bulls. Let's remember the doctrine of discovery. This is something that they were trying to get land for Christianity, right? They're trying to get land for their kings and queens of their newly established countries of Europe. And so here we go. Let's get into it. It's really, really important. So the Criollo independence of Mexico and white supremacy. All right. So we're portrayed that there's a independence of Mexico, right? September 16, 1810 through September 16, 1821. The Criollos, or Creoles as they call themselves, fight for independence of Mexico with the help of indigenous and so-called mestizo populations. But power and leadership remained in the Criollo hands afterwards. This is really, really important. It's really, really important because, again, just like here in the United States, right? The British were trying to gain independence from England and trying to break free, and the taxation without representation. And they had all these battles and wars. They wanted to be independent on native land, right? So that they didn't have to give tribute and tax to their crown, to their motherland that was taxing them and taxing all the colonies that they were creating for those kingdoms, right? So let's decolonize this a little bit. As someone mentioned, yeah, this flag is not of our doing, right? It's not an indigenous representation, only a very distorted version of the serpent holding a snake. I'm sorry, the eagle holding a serpent in its beak. So yeah, this is a colonialist and Eurocentric process. It represents the ideals of the Criollo class and the elite. It's really important to get to that because today, this is the biggest lie that we are told, that, oh, Mexico is independent, but we're going to unpack that. I don't want to get a little too ahead of myself, but let's unpack what that meant, right? And just as an example, the colors of the so-called Mexican flag, right? The green represents the faith in a better nation, right? The white color represents the purity of the Catholic faith. And red represents the color of blood, right? The color of the blood, I would say, is the blood of the indigenous people, that all of us that participated in this and were used under this new guise of a new nation. That's the blood that was used. And over here to your left, you see the traditional views of what the Grito de Hidalgo and the representation of who were these leaders, right, that were fighting for this independence. And it's really, really important. Down here, this is the people, these are the criollos, right, who kept coming in, and we'll get into the immigration policies, but that's whom they wanted the leadership. That's whom wanted to govern this newly established colony that is now known as Mexico. And, you know, another lie that they want to tell us is that, oh, you know, there's all these white Mexicans and, you know, it's so, you know, they came naturally. It was not a natural thing. Okay. The whitening of Mexico happened because of the actual tactical way that immigration was allowed into Mexico from particularly European countries. Okay, so you already have a leading government of criollos who are fighting for independence. And then now we're looking at trying to withhold that white presence of Mexico. And so what they're doing, and I want to kind of point out that this actually is taking place right before the Mexican Revolution. So let's start thinking about that, right? What is happening to indigenous land? Let me get into this law. There's many laws that took place at this time, but this one is really, really important. In January of 1883, there was a general law of colonization, right? And this particular law promoted Irish, German, and French immigration to Mexico, and this time with very few restrictions that resulted in the arrival of more European immigrants and their families. So this is a very common example of what happened all over. This didn't just happen in Mexico and Central America, but it happened in so-called South America too. It was a trend, right, to widen up these, previously indigenous populations. Like they wanted to be European, they wanted to make it look like Europe. And so what this results in is a complete domination of the resources of Mexico, the textile industry, business and industry domain, the sustaining of the white criollo elite. So this is how that elite of Mexico today was created. It wasn't just the original Spaniards, right? And this is what I'm learning as well, right? That immigration policies in Mexico, like very much like the US policies, have been very exclusionary to particular populations, right? To white populations. If you have a white supremacist model, you want to maintain it with populations. So let's get into it. Okay, to get you more examples, we're looking at the history of Mexico after we're looking at Mexico was created, right? Then we have all these decades of white immigration into Mexico. And so these white immigrants into Mexico are saying, you know what? We are the new race here. This is our new country. We need to do everything in our power to make it civil, make it modern, right? And so you have in 1892 and around these decades, you have what is called the científicos in Spanish and English, the scientists. So the scientists, this is what they call themselves as well. It was a group of people that formed a power block in Mexican political life who were mostly urban criollos who distanced themselves from provincial life and marginalizing the indigenous people they considered a backward race. Down here, what we're looking at, this gentleman, this settler right here, is Andrés Molina Enriquez. So he's and there's a lot of writers that come from this school of thought. He's one of them. Andrés Molina Enriquez in 1909 wrote a book called The Great National Problems. And in this book, he proposes that the quote unquote advanced evolution of whites makes them a central element for the national integration of indigenous people. So what are we looking here, right? What is this speaking you about? This is talking about finding science and using eugenics to talk about in a very paternal way of how to integrate all these brown people into our political scheme. How do we, take them over, exploit their resources, but maintain our power because, we're the advanced, evolved ones, right? That's the philosophy behind this thought process. And here we go. Let's get into, now we're jumping over to 20th century colonial romanticism of invasion, right? The romantic view of the Spanish so-called conquest. So these are very popular, right? These are popular in Mexico. They're popular in museums. They have like a very godly look to them, right? These Spaniards who are like coming in and about to bring a civilization. And so I'm going to be answering these questions tonight. What are the racial ideas found in politics and society in Mexico? Where do they come from, right? And again, the Spanish invasion happened in 16th century and 1500s. Why all of a sudden is there such a political interest in reviving and talking about Indigenous people? There is so much that happened at this time. Here we go. Let's get into it. The legend of Mestizaje, an ideology of white power. This is extremely, extremely important. I think that one of the biggest, challenges that we face as people that are brown, indigenous folks, those of us that are colonially called Mexican, Central American, South American, are these ideas of mestizaje, right? Mestizaje, somos mestizos, mixed blood, miscegenation, right? There's so much established in the foundation. So what we're going to get into tonight is, what is mestizaje? What are the racial ideas of this concept? And what does eugenics have to do with this? Centering whiteness and the myth of the Spanish grandfather, which, a lot of us claim. And also we're going to get into the patriarchal and machista legend that's also infiltrated into this romanticized version of mixed blood and fifth race, right? So these images are popular, right? Some of them are from paintings of Diego Rivera. Some of them are actual social campaigns that were used to promote the racial hierarchies in Mexico. And as you can see here, we have different populations and also Black Mexicans, right? Is what we're looking at, the casta system. So we cannot talk about mestizaje, we cannot talk about raza without getting into the forefather, right? The mero fregón that did this. And basically, as you can see, a lot of people were already creating these thoughts. A lot of people were already thinking this, right? And so what we're looking at here is the official essay that was written by Jose Vasconcelos, who was a criollo himself. He was a criollo himself who wrote an essay and wrote different books about what was the cosmic race, the raza cósmica. And let's get into it, right? Because not a lot of us get a chance to unpack this and be critical, because this is not really popular on his end, right? So in the 1930s, we're looking, eugenics was a worldwide scientific and social movement based on heredity that involved a set of policy proposals to encourage the reproduction of individuals in shape, right? And to restrict those considered not fit to achieve the best breeding goal. And this is being recorded live, so I don't want to read every quote that I'm providing you with tonight, but let's get into one of them, right? Let's read the first one. Okay, so these quotes were taken mainly from this book, Jose Vasconcelos, La Raza Cósmica. It has been translated to many languages. You can find it in the English language. And so let's see what's up with this whole cosmic race thing. What does that mean, right? And so the first quote, it says, a religion like Christianity made the Indians advance in a few centuries from cannibalism to a relative degree of civilization, right? And just like he talks about this, about indigenous people, he has a problem with everyone who is not white, right? And he basically centralizes whiteness as the driving force behind mestizaje, as a driving force to support his ideals, because he felt that they were leading the world, right? They were leading the world with religion and language, and all these poor savages of the world have to be part of this new blood because, we were just helpless, right? According to white supremacy. So I welcome you to read his essay. It's not too lengthy, but you'll get into, he even talks about that we're the Atlantis, right? That we're Los Atlantis, the sunken city, that we come from that. I mean, complete racist interpretations of who we are. And today we use the term openly without knowing, right? How damaging and eugenist it was. And not only that, as if this wasn't enough, right? As if this wasn't enough. Let's get into this. Jose Vasconcelos himself, and I want to give credit to this this woman I knew a few years ago who actually brought this up in her research. She actually let us know about this. So Jose Vasconcelos was actually a paid propagandist, right? He was a paid Nazi propagandist and director of the magazine known Timon. Okay, this is, it shouldn't shock us, right? Because we already, if you follow his writings of Raza Cósmica and then you find this about him, it's reinforcing each other, right? And so, yeah, he's a paid propagandist. That's him right here, right? Pictures of the German Nazis and some of the cartoons that come from Timon. And on the video description, I'm actually giving you some links to some of these writings so you can see. But that is what is happening here. Okay, that is what is happening. We have a criollo who is getting paid by the German government to promote the German ideas of race and eugenics. So there's actually a merging movement, right? So all these people in Mexico, you got the people in Germany, they all want a white world, and they're working hard and they're funding each other to do this. And so how are you such a nationalist and all this whole idea, right, of a race, when in reality you're getting paid, right, to promote the Nazi party and German politics. So yes, this is him. He was a paid propagandist. Other historians have talked about this, and it's adding to what he already stands for, right? And so now let's take a look back and look at the institutions, look at the racial ideas of Mestizaje. And what we're going to look into here is a critique made by Federico Navarrete, right, the Mexican anthropologist. And one of the things that he looks into is talking about that if you follow the pattern of Mestizaje, Mestizaje is patriarchal and machista centered, like hands down. All the images that you see here are always centering a white male, right? It's always a white male that's the leading, paternal figure in the image of Mestizaje. And so what that does, it's a visual representation of patriarchy, but a vision that represents patriarchy, but now on indigenous lands or in African lands. It's always a white man that has the role of a father, paternal, and it's always a brown or black woman that is the feminized or the feminine aspect of racial definitions. Okay, so what I wrote here, it says ideas of the ideas in art are about the indigenous woman and the white man. It does not allow any other variation. The father is always the European man. Mestizaje reinforced patriarchal and white-centered male power. It completely erases indigenous people and other populations. The concept is racist. So as we know, we have African slaves. There's even some noted Asians that are in Mexico at this time. But according to the mestizo model, right, it's only a white man and only an indigenous woman. And Federico Navarrete has great work because he actually confronts this interpretation and this racist view. And he said that it was impossible to have so many, so-called mixed babies because the population of this white presence, the white elite, was so small. So by them even arguing that, it's saying, are we saying that white males had this supernatural power of fertility? Right? And it really does show you how white supremacy is illustrated and supported by Mestizaje. And so just to close up this topic, right, with Vasconcelos, is that, yeah, it's Mestizaje, the fifth race, raza. It glamorizes European colonization. It centers whiteness. It talks about eugenics, right, controlling black and brown bodies. And it doesn't look to honor and celebrate anybody. It looks to completely take over what is indigenous and other populations of Mexico. So that is why this term is racist. That is why this term is white supremacist. That is why I'm presenting this, because this is not being covered, right? Even in Mexico themselves, they're having a hard time talking about these issues because it's so embedded. It's so embedded in the way that we identify as so-called, Mexicanos. It's such a living part of the identity. Whew, are you ready for this? Oh my goodness. This research I'm about to show you right now, it blew my mind, okay? This also comes from Federico Navarrete. If you look at the ideological ideas of Mestizaje, Federico Navarrete actually looks at the numbers. He's saying, okay, if they're claiming that we're mixed blood, if we're saying that we're this and that, let's look at the numbers, right? He's saying, let's look at the populations. Let's see how this adds up. Oh, I'm so excited about this. I don't even know. Okay. Whew. Okay. Between, I got to get ready for this. Hold on. Let me get ready. This is powerful. Between 1821 and 1910, 3.5 million, and put that in there, 3.5 million indigenous people were categorized to the mestizo category as mestizo. This is powerful. Okay, let's look into it. This comes, right? These findings come from the Censo de Población from 1930. So this is actually the Mexican census of 1930. And look at how big of a factor this is. Oh, this is huge. This is really exciting to share. Oh man. Okay, here we go. By the time the Mexican census of 1930 took place, 30% of the entire Mexican population who had been identified as indigenous was now categorized as mestizos. Bam. Historians argue that this was also done to repress the casta wars, guerras de casta, and erase the power of the indigenous population. The white elite feared that they would lose their power. That's powerful. Okay, let me get into the next point. Whoo! Bam! Receipts all day long. All right. Mestizaje was not a racial reality, but rather a, quote, massive linguistic displacement. Indigenous people were whitened up through language and culture, not racially. Whew. Oh, sorry. I got to read that one again. Okay. So what happens here is that the Mexican government, right, there's all these uprisings happening because it wasn't like a steady decline of indigenous resistance and we all just accepted and said, oh, yeah, you know, it's a white world, you know, we're all here. No, there was constant resistance. There was constant battles, constant uprisings known as the casta wars, okay, the guerra de castas. So as a way to flatten and smash and destroy those uprisings, they said, no, like we need to take them in. We need to pretend like we're all one people, right? We're all one happy mestizo country because these people are going to take us out of power. Right? So the political intention was that, the racial intention, and Federico Navarrete, he argues that there are not enough interracial marriages at this time between so-called, Spanish men and indigenous women that are even significant. Most people at this time in these 400 years were marrying each other, right? Because of the racist and purposeful, borders of racism of Mexico, people were marrying each other, right? There wasn't the significant interracial relationships going on, and the stats prove it. And you can read that in the census. You can read it from the work of Federico Navarrete. That is powerful. So it's not that indigenous people stopped existing. It's not that we just, we're all white now. No, it's just that the markers, the identity markers were used to erase the indigenous population. This is a huge population. 3.5 million people all of a sudden are considered mestizos, right? And seen as Spanish-speaking Mexicans, so no longer associated with being indigenous, which leads me to my next argument, right? And the argument that many Mexican historians are giving as well. And it says, many Mexicans who do not currently speak an indigenous language come from communities that were erased and whose indigenous languages were repressed by the new economic models and pressure to become mestizos. Ask the elders in your family and see what was the indigenous language spoken by your great-great-grandparents. This is huge, right? Because a lot of us think, oh, well, I'm not indigenous, you know, I don't speak the language, or I'm not indigenous, I didn't grow up with that. I want to ask you to do something. I'm going to give you a homework assignment. My homework assignment for you is to ask your elders, right? If you have that blessing right now to have an elder in your family, ask your oldest relative, you know, if they speak it, or this is the people that don't speak it, right? Or what do they remember that their ancestors, that their great-grandparents, their grandparents spoke? And this is powerful because for the last 200 years, Mexicans have not been identified as indigenous because of the repression of the indigenous presence and identities in Mexico. Which leads me, now we're looking at the current situation, right? We're fast forwarding over to the 20th century. And this is huge because if we're following these racial norms and this racialized elite, right, that reinforces itself with white supremacy, we have this meme I created. I don't know who the artist is. If anyone knows the artist, please let me know. But I think it's beautiful because this part here, I found, I'm not even sure where, but I added my own little flavor to it, right? Okay, so I created this about 2-3 years ago. And it says, colonialism did not end with the invention of Criollo-led nations. The exploitation of our resources and bodies does not mean that we are independent. And what you're seeing here is all the so-called flags of Mexico, Central, and South America, right? So we're taught that, you know, these nations, right, are free nations, and they, you know, we have all this Latino unity and these Latino cultures, right? But in reality, if you look at the legacies of power and the racial interpretations, they're still intact. They are still intact. Let me give you an example. Bam. There's a lot more, okay? I could have filled this up and you could do a simple like family genealogy on this and you'll see it. So as an example of this, we have the president, he was an ex-president of Mexico, Vicente Fox, right? So let me read here. It says, Spanish Criollo Euro-descendant power is still intact in Mexico. The racial oligarchy continues. So let's talk about this real quick, right? A lot of us don't know. And this is important for us to know. So Vicente Fox was born July 2nd, 1942 in Mexico City. His father, right? His father, Jose Luis Fox Pont, was Mexican of German, French, and Spanish descent. His mother, Mercedes Quesada Ixiade, was a Basque immigrant from San Sebastian, Guipúzcoa, Spain. Exactly what I'm talking about. So this that we're talking about, right, going back to the establishment of a white elite, the establishment of all this, you know, it follows a pattern that is into, right, the científicos, we're looking at all that. It follows this racialized pattern of power to Mexico today, right? So it's important for us to be critical of how nationalism is presented to us and how we are, you know, presumed to be identifying. We're told to identify that this is a compatriota, that is, you know, our paisano. But if you look at it, there's nothing wrong with being diverse, right? And diversity. But the majority of the power cabinets and presidents of Mexico are not of indigenous, you know, communities, right? They are still Europeans, still criollos. And so now let's get into the resistance. Let's get into who are the biggest decolonial resistant voices of Mexico. And this is really exciting. It's very inspiring to know that there's people that actually know what's happening and that are confronting it, right? This book here, It's 500 años fregados pero cristianos. This is a political cartoonist by the name of Eduardo del Rio Garcia. He's already passed, rest in the universe. But it is powerful the way that he critiques not just the Mexican government, but religion. He critiques the governments. He critiques all these social ideas that are repressive and that really dehumanize, the Mexican population. And this is so important. Let's take a closer look at one of his cartoons, right? So this is, and we're going to try to get the PDF available for you. Okay, look at this example. This is powerful. Okay, so part of that book, 500 años fregados pero cristianos, he has an image there of a Spaniard, right? And it's like human sacrifice, right? The image of that. But what he takes out of this indigenous man's chest is the Western hemisphere. Okay, this is powerful. We cannot interpret this, our own way. The way that I view this powerful political cartoon is that nationalism was created by sacrificing indigenous people, right? And the heart and soul of the resources, of the cultures, of the foods, of what makes who we are such a beautiful people is because we are indigenous, right? Is because we have thousands of years of beautiful culture, foods, languages, diversity. And that to me represents what took place, right? Starting in 1492. So it's sacrificing of our ancestors. And this happened globally, right? We could say this about other populations as well. But this is powerful. You can find this in his book. And I have attached that to the video description of this class tonight. Okay, the other book that we're going to get into, México Profundo. I'm just going to touch on, like I said in the introduction to tonight's course, this is a very powerful book. This Mexican anthropologist also has already passed. He has problems with how Mexico is portraying itself, right? He has a problem with how in Mexico they try to, eroticize the indigenous past and glamorize the indigenous past, but completely discriminate and repress indigenous communities today. And he's saying, stop trying to be white, stop trying to be westernized, stop trying to be something you're not. We need to return back to the foundation of who we are, which is, in his terminology, Mesoamerica. This is incredible. Like, his work is profound. He worked with not just as an anthropologist, but he has a lot of work with indigenous language utilization and a bunch of stuff. So really, really powerful. And this, I am so excited to share with you. Like I said, I'm constantly learning. I'm constantly trying to research, and what people need to understand, that even though I did go to academia and I graduated with my master's, most of the knowledge that I come across was not introduced to me in academia. That's really important to understand. Most of the information I'm learning is for the people I talk to through collective circles, through my activism. And so to find out so many rich historians and research that is happening, it's so empowering, right? It's empowering. So let me introduce you to Federico Navarrete. I absolutely am right now dedicated to learning, finding out more about his research. He is a Mexican anthropologist, and he has strong criticisms, right, of white supremacy in Mexico. And first of all, he has a lot of work. So you can find his books here. It's called México Racista, Racist Mexico, una denuncia, Alfabeto del Racismo Mexicano. And basically he says Mestizaje is an ideology of power. He also says, legend has it that mestizos are by definition children of a Spanish father and indigenous woman. So he's saying that in itself makes everyone else invisible. It makes everyone else who does not fit that standard of race invisible. And he said, basically critiquing and saying, we must all participate, even if we don't want to, in the process of national mestizaje, miscegenation. It means in practice, whitewashing and westernization. So he's saying that the concept of mestizo is nationalized as a way to erase who we are as indigenous people, as brown folks, right? And it's powerful. So I want to introduce you to him. And what are we confront with, right? What are we challenging? What are the ideals that are being promoted right now? If I were to turn on a novela right now, what's going to come out on my screen? This is going to come out on my screen, right? This is what we're battling against. This is what we're talking about, white supremacy in the media. And a lot of historians are talking about this because this is what fuels power, right? Power is representation, it's imagery, it's messages, social and racial messages that are socialized in the representation of mass media. And so let's get into this, right? I am looking at some of the comments here, so I'm excited to be able to comment back. So here we go. So when we turn on Spanish-speaking media, right, a lot of these are from Mexico, what we see is these depictions of who we are as indigenous people. And one of the things that the historians talk about is that the majority of us in so-called Mexico, as we looked at the census, are indigenous people, right? Indigenous people under these false categories of mestizo. And then you look at us over here in the so-called US, and now we have these categories of Latino, Hispano. It's all the same stuff. White supremacy. Okay, so then I went on to YouTube, and there's this new thing called white Mexicans, white Mexicans, something like that. And I could not believe the title of their videos. No todos los mexicanos son morenos. Not all Mexicans are dark skinned. So to me, the fact that you have to make a YouTube video created to talk about whiteness in Mexico as if it's not already normalized in the mainstream media is pathetic, right? It's this idea that, I'm not the indigenous aspect of Mexico. I'm the white one, right? I'm the one that came from France and the one that came from Paris. So this whole idea of racism is really talked about right now. This is popular, right? This is popular. And, this is already getting to the end of my talk tonight, but I want us to look at this, because look at this. The popular series of Netflix is called Made in Mexico. And look at them. They're all, Europeans, right? With the Mexican passport, right? This is what is being promoted. And then on YouTube channels, and I like to watch this because it tells you where the psyche is. Look at the comments. There was a video about criollos in Mexico, and Criollos Blancos, that's the name of this person's YouTube channel. He says, en Mexico habemos criollos blancos también. Like, are you kidding me? Like, how do you not feel like you're part of the platform and you're put on a pedestal as a white so-called Mexican, right? And then this guy down here, he put, rescatemos nuestra identidad criolla. Viva Mexico. Let us rescue our Creole identity. Viva Mexico. And so we're looking at this false manufactured representation of Mexico when in essence, most of us, right, have come from displaced indigenous populations, come from erased indigenous populations that no longer were able to continue speaking their languages, right? And so this is very painful, but we have to talk about this. And I hope that tonight, after you watch this, I hope that, you could talk about this with your family, because it's very painful, right? The racism that we practice in our communities, it's normalized, right? Like, let's look at an example over here. So the normalcy of white supremacy, frases cotidianas, right? These are some of the common phrases that a lot of us can relate to. A lot of us grew up listening or making maybe these comments ourselves, right? In our ignorance, in our self-hate. Cásate con un güero para mejorar la raza. Marry a white person to better the race. These are daily phrases, frases cotidianas. Another thing we're caught saying is, when a baby is born, it's like, let me see your baby. Does he have blue eyes? Does he have green eyes? And it's like this obsession with white features, right? And then the other one, it says, no estés mucho en el sol, te vas a poner bien india or bien prieta, right? That's another comment that we grew up with saying. And
we kind of brush it off like, oh, like it's funny. We don't really have the critical lens to think about it. Or another one that says, no seas naco. Naco has been racialized almost in every instance, and there's been sociological studies on this. There's been tons of evidence and remarks and surveys that they do. Naco basically means poor indigenous person, right? And obviously the last one is estás bien indio. You're really Indian, right? And so these are the comments that are live today, talking about bettering the race, something that has been, indoctrinated in our psyche since the 16th century. It continues to exist in the languages that we're speaking of, right? And to get into that, yeah. So another great things that are happening, that people that are challenging this, is there's a lot of social campaigns in Mexico. A lot of it happened in 2011, 2009. And if you YouTube this, I can't share it right now, but if you YouTube this information, ¿Sabe México que es racista? Does Mexico know that it is racist? You're going to find a lot of videos, and I shared on my Facebook and other platforms about little surveys that they're doing for people, to kids, right? The brown doll, white doll social experiment. There's a new shift in the population of Mexico to start challenging these very toxic and damaging ideas, right? And of course, I had to add my little 2 cents. I myself continue as well, right? I make little YouTube videos. I try to do some in Spanish and English, and talk about the racism or raza cósmica. As you can imagine, I get a lot of crap for that. But we have to talk about it. When I talk to youth and protest, using all platforms that I possibly can, right, to bring this to awareness and to talk about it, because we don't talk about it. It's a painful conversation to have. Um, and so where we at? Yeah. So I wanted to highlight that. And to end, just I know a lot of you asked me about the books that I've had. I have three books that you can find where I'm talking about this as well. My thesis, I published that last year. You can find that. My Kindle version or ebook of Obsidian Blades, my poetry book, you can find that as well. And I also have this on my link tree. So with that, I am going to end tonight's session. I'm going to look at some of the comments here. I wanted to let you know that I'm really excited for next week. Next Friday, we have a very, very special course of something that's absolutely vital, right? A lot of things that are confusing us, a lot of things that are challenging us. It's I have a special guest, my brother Huitziliolot Anahuac. He's going to be talking about and showing us ways of how to decolonize DNA results. I always get daily, I get messages about, being a displaced Indigenous person, not knowing how to find our records, not knowing how to find our Indigenous, family tree. And like I shared, right, in my talk tonight, I talked about how a lot of things are manipulated, how a lot of things they don't allow for proper representation. A lot of Indigenous populations have been erased, right? Have been um taken into the whole Mestizaje. And so Brother Witiyolo actually has been doing this for years, is finding his own history, right? Not just through DNA, but he's going to share other things that he is doing to try to find out exactly where he comes from. Because again, if you have census, documents that are completely, misrepresenting the populations, it's a huge challenge. So I wanted to let you know what's happening next week. And if I can give you a sneak preview as well, the week after that, I'm going to have Brother Cuitlawak from speaknahuatl.com. He's going to give us a great class as an introduction to the Nahuatl language. So that's coming up. So again, that is my guest lecture next week, May 22nd. It's going to be with Tiyolo Nahuatl about decolonizing DNA results. And after that, we're going to have with Lawak from speaknahuatl.com joining us. And to end, I just want to remind you to please, if you get a chance, I'm going to be posting the Google form is already found on the video description, where you can please fill out a Google form for me. It helps me. You know, I do this for free. I do this because I'm passionate about all of us learning this, about all this research, right, that is coming across. And I'll leave that there too. And to ask you for your evaluation, right? If you have questions, comments, you have any particular idea for me, I'm always looking to evaluate how I'm presenting my content, my approach. It's really important to me. So before I go off, I am looking at some of the comments. So I first of all want to thank you for joining me on this Friday night. I'm really excited that I get to share space with you. I'm really excited. So I'm looking at some of the comments right now. I do keep these videos on. So as soon as I go offline, I do keep it on there because I do want everyone to be able to watch this. I do it live because I want to engage with you. I think there's something very powerful when we're, connecting live together, like as a way to connect at a human level because of everything that's happening. I think it's really, really important, right? So here we go. So I'm just looking at some of the comments just real quick before I let you all go. I'm very happy to see all you here. Daniel Garcia, Ricardo Serrano, Alexis Perez, Francisco Tizoc, Daniel, Edgar Herrera, Aztec 101, El Red Dog. I want to give you all a shout out. Thank you for joining me. And I will see you next week. We have decolonizing our DNA results. This video will be on here on my YouTube channel. Feel free to look at it again. I know I went over tons of information. I try to give you as much sources as possible. This is my interpretation. This is my summary. None of the books that I recommend are perfect. I don't know if there is one that's perfect, but I think it's important that we have these conversations and that we share space and that we start challenging a lot of these painful ideas that we have about who we are. So everyone, Elizabeth, Frank, Payson, I don't know how to say that name. Thank you so much for joining me. And you guys enjoy the rest of your weekend. I hope you are safe and stay well, everybody. Have a good night. Thank you. Good night.